What happens when an execution doesn't go as planned? Lethal injection failures, electric chair malfunctions, even inmates who seemingly refuse to die. These are the haunting stories that stain the legacy of capital punishment in America. Today we uncover the most shocking cases of botched executions in America, the horrifying details of what went wrong and what happens if an inmate survives. Stay tuned for the chilling truth. Clayton Lockett State. Clayton Lockett, State, Oklahoma. Execution date, April 29, 2014. Clayton Lockett entered Oklahoma's death chamber, but what was meant to be a controlled execution turned into a nightmare. Lockett was convicted for the 1999 murder of 19-year-old Stephanie Neiman. During a home invasion, he and his accomplices beat her, raped her friend, shot her, and buried her alive when she refused to give up security codes. He was sentenced to death in 2000. 14 years later, Oklahoma prepared to carry out his execution, but would go horribly wrong. That night, the state used a new, untested 3-drug cocktail: midazolam to sedate, vecuronium bromide to paralyze, and potassium chloride to stop the heart. But the 4-line was inserted improperly. Instead of entering his bloodstream, the chemicals leaked into his tissue. What followed was not a peaceful death, but 43 minutes of agony. Lockett began to writhe, convulse, and groan in pain. Despite being declared unconscious, he was clearly suffering. At one point, he lifted his head, eyes wide, and tried to speak. The execution chamber fell into chaos. Witnesses, journalists, lawyers, prison officials were horrified. A doctor checked the 4. The drugs weren't working. Lockett continued to thrash and moan, his body reacting violently to the chemicals coursing through his tissue. After 33 excruciating minutes, the execution was halted, but it was already too late. 10 minutes later, Clayton Lockett died of a heart attack. In all, his execution lasted 43 minutes, one of the longest and most disturbing in modern U.S. history. The state had aimed for a quick clinical procedure. What it delivered was a public display of suffering. Lockett's death triggered national and international outrage. Civil rights groups, legal experts, and even foreign governments condemned the execution. Executions in Oklahoma were suspended temporarily, as officials scrambled to understand how it had gone so wrong. It raised disturbing questions. How safe are these drug protocols? How closely are they tested? And is lethal injection really as humane as we're told? Lockett was guilty of a brutal crime, but even his worst enemies couldn't ignore the botched horror of his death. His case exposed the darker side of capital punishment in America, one riddled with secrecy, experimentation, and avoidable mistakes. He may have gone to the death chamber to face justice, but what the world saw was something far more chilling. A man convulsing in pain, while the system that sentenced him to die failed to even kill him properly. Coffin cause of death, heart attack. Stopwatch execution duration, 43 minutes. Balance scale convicted of murder during home invasion. Warning method, lethal injection, botched. Clayton Lockett's execution wasn't just a death sentence. It was a national wake-up call. Jesse Taffero, State, Florida. Execution date, May 4th, 1990. Jesse Taffero was strapped into the electric chair. He was about to face the death penalty, but what happened next would scar the witnesses forever. Taffero had been convicted of the 1976 murder of 2 police officers during a traffic stop. He and his partner were accused of shooting the officers at point-blank range. Taffero claimed he was innocent, but the courts didn't agree. After 14 years on death row, the state prepared to carry out his sentence. The method, electrocution, Florida's infamous electric chair. But on that morning, a critical mistake was made. Instead of using a natural sea sponge, which conducts electricity properly, officials used a synthetic sponge. The result? Poor conductivity and a horrifying chain of events. When the switch was flipped, electricity surged into Taffero's body, but unevenly. Flames shot from his head. Smoke poured from his face mask. His body jerked violently, fists clenched in agony. Witnesses were frozen in horror, the room filled with the smell of burning flesh. A sound like sizzling meat echoed through the chamber. Tafaro didn't die right away. He suffered through 3 jolts of electricity over 7 torturous minutes. Each time the current was applied, his body reacted violently, slamming against the chair, limbs twitching. Reporters present that day called it one of the most gruesome executions ever seen. One said, "He caught fire in front of us." It was like something out of a horror movie. Even the prison officials, used to executions, were shaken. Some questioned whether Tafaro had even been guilty. His girlfriend, Sonia Jacobs, had her sentence overturned. She was released, and many wondered, had Jesse Tafaro been wrongly put to death? The public outcry was immediate. Human rights groups demanded answers. Why was the wrong equipment used? Why was no one held accountable? Florida's use of the electric chair came under fire. They had promised a swift, painless death. Instead, they delivered a public immolation. Tafaro's case became a symbol of the flaws in capital punishment, an example of what happens when the system cuts corners, and a man pays with his life in fire. In the years that followed, Florida would continue using the electric chair, but with growing controversy. Eventually, lethal injection replaced it as the primary method. But the scars of Jesse Tafaro's death never faded. He wasn't just executed. He was set on fire in front of a room full of people. Fire cause of death, electrocution, botched. Stopwatch execution duration, 7 minutes. Balance scale convicted of double murder of law enforcement officers. Jesse Tafaro's final moments weren't silent. They were screaming. George Machine Gun Barrett. State, Indiana. Date of execution, 1936. In the 1930s, America was gripped by crime and chaos. And George Machine Gun Barrett was one of its most feared names. A Depression-era gangster, Barrett became infamous after gunning down an FBI agent in cold blood. He was captured, convicted, and sentenced to death. But his execution would go down in history, not for justice, but for horror. In 1936, Barrett became the first man executed in the federal electric chair. Officials called it a modern method, humane, efficient, but when the switch was thrown, everything went wrong. The first jolt hit, but it didn't kill him. Smoke filled the air. The smell of burning flesh made witnesses recoil in shock. Barrett groaned and began to moan and writhe in pain. His body convulsed against the restraints, alive and clearly suffering. A second jolt was delivered. Still he lived. Those in the chamber watched in horror as Barrett clung to life. His body twitching, jaw clenched, eyes flickering. The third jolt came next. And finally, after over 15 agonizing minutes, George Barrett was dead. By then, the execution chamber reeked of death. The air was thick with smoke and trauma. One witness described it as a nightmare from which you couldn't wake. Barrett's execution was supposed to showcase progress. Instead, it exposed the cruelty behind the electric chair. Officials tried to downplay the failure, but the story leaked. Newspapers across the country ran headlines about the botched job. The promise of a quick, painless death had been shattered. What people saw was torture behind a legal curtain. To this day, Barrett's execution remains one of the earliest and most graphic examples of how flawed the death penalty process can be. The same chair that was meant to bring closure brought more questions than answers. Questions about humanity, about cruelty, and about whether any system can guarantee a humane death. Barrett may have been a killer, but on that day, the state showed it was capable of horror too. His death helped spark national debate, one that still rages nearly a century later. Because no matter the crime, no one forgets the image of a man burning in the chair for over 15 minutes. Method: electrocution. Execution time: 15 plus minutes. Convicted of murder of a federal agent. Legacy: first ever federal electrocution. But instead of being a model, it became a warning. A warning that even the modern death penalty can be barbaric in disguise. Barrett's execution chamber is gone now, but the memory of what happened inside it still haunts the history books and in the debate over life and death. His case is often Exhibit A for how the system can fail. Willie Francis, State, Louisiana, date of execution, 1946. A 16-year-old black teenager named Willie Francis was led to the electric chair in Louisiana. He had been convicted of the murder of a local pharmacist, Andrew Thomas. But questions surrounded the case about the investigation, the trial, and whether justice had truly been served. Regardless, the sentence was clear: death by electrocution. But what happened next was unlike anything the justice system had ever seen. The electric chair, known as Gruesome Gertie, had been transported across the state, set up hastily by 2 prison guards, both of whom were reportedly drunk. The wiring was faulty, the connections were loose, and no one double-checked it before throwing the switch. As the current surged into Willie's body, he screamed and convulsed. But something was wrong. The chair wasn't delivering enough voltage to kill him. 0:55. He cried out, "Take it off! Take it off! Let me breathe!" His body twitched violently, smoke filled the room, but he was still alive. Panic spread. Officials scrambled to shut it down. The execution had failed. Willie Francis had survived the electric chair, something that wasn't supposed to be possible. He was removed from the chair, still conscious, burned, dazed but alive. What followed was a legal and moral firestorm. Could the state execute him again? Would a second attempt constitute cruel and unusual punishment under the U.S. Constitution? The case went all the way to the Supreme Court. In a 5-4 decision, the court ruled, yes, the state could legally try again. The justices who dissented called the decision barbaric, but it was final. 1 year later, in 1947, Willie Francis was strapped back into the same chair. This time it worked. He was 17, and after surviving the impossible, the system succeeded in ending his life. To this day, Willie Francis remains the only known person in U.S. history to survive a botched electrocution, only to be executed again later. His case sparked debates that continue even now. Can justice still be justice when it's delivered in such a broken, brutal way? Francis's final words before his second execution were chilling. He looked at the witnesses and simply said, "Goodbye. No entry first attempt. Failed due to faulty setup. High voltage second attempt. Successful after 1 year. Balance scale convicted of murder. Adult balance scale age at first execution attempt, 16. Willie Francis didn't die the first time, but the system made sure he did the second. John Lewis Evans, State, Alabama. Date of execution, 1983. April 22nd, 1983. Holman Correctional Facility, Alabama. Inside the execution chamber stood a device with a nickname, Yellow Mama, Alabama's electric chair. Strapped into it was John Lewis Evans, a man convicted of a brutal crime spree that left 1 man dead during a robbery. His conviction wasn't in question, but what happened during his execution would become one of the most gruesome episodes in modern capital punishment history. Evans had chosen to waive all appeals. He wanted the death penalty. He wanted it fast, and the state was prepared to grant his wish. At 8:30 p.m., the first jolt was administered. 1,900 volts of electricity for 30 seconds. The smell of burning flesh filled the room. Smoke poured from beneath his hood. His body tensed, jerked violently, then slumped. The execution team waited. But Evans wasn't dead. He was still breathing, still moving. His heart still beating. A second jolt was administered. More smoke, more spasms. Witnesses could see blood seeping through his white shirt. He groaned. He hadn't died yet. 1:18. At this point, even seasoned prison staff looked away. Journalists stared in horror. The electric chair was failing, but the process couldn't be stopped. 1:28. A third jolt was delivered. Another 30 seconds. Finally, his body went still. It had taken 14 minutes. 3 rounds of voltage. Smoke, sparks, blood, and fire. To kill 1 man. Later reports described the scene as a medieval spectacle. Not an execution, but a public torture. The U.S. Supreme Court had allowed Evans's execution to proceed, but few had anticipated it would go so horrifically wrong. Afterward, attorneys and journalists filed complaints. Human rights groups demanded that the electric chair be banned. Alabama refused. They claimed the chair worked as intended, that Evans's pain was not unusual. But eyewitnesses told a very different story. One reporter wrote, "It was like watching someone being cooked alive in slow motion." Evans became a grim symbol of everything wrong with the death penalty, not because he was innocent, but because his death looked more like revenge than justice. For years, Alabama kept using Yellow Mama, but Evans's execution haunted everyone who saw it. High voltage method, electrocution, botched. Stopwatch execution duration, 14 minutes. Drop of blood injuries, burns, bleeding, prolonged consciousness. Balance scale convicted of murder during robbery. John Lewis Evans didn't just die. He burned to death in front of a room full of people. Which case shocked you the most? Tell us in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more true crime history.